By the second week of October, Pannel Creek had gone so quiet you could hear a leaf land on it. The pond behind the Bevan Dam had taken 11 hours to fill. It would empty in 40 minutes. Inside the mill, the runner stone was already turning, and Jory Trelawney had his ear against the vat, listening to a sound nobody else in Arvel County could have read. The stone was warming. He could hear it in the pitch, not a grind anymore. A whisper, too smooth, the sound of two faces kissing instead of cutting. Somewhere under 4,000 pounds of French bourre, a bale had shifted, and the runner had come down heavy on its western edge. 26 households had their winter corn stacked along the wall in feed sacks with names chalked on them. Enid Bevan stood at the head gate with both hands on the sluice lever. If she dropped it now, the water stopped, the stone stopped, and the pond they had waited half a day for would run on down the mountain to nothing. If she waited too long, the meal would come out hot, and hot meal turned by Christmas, and 26 families would open their bins in January to something they could not eat. She could not see Jory. He had taken a lantern down under the husk frame, into the space between the floor and the wheel shaft, where a man had to lie on his back in the dark with the machinery running over his chest. Her husband had gone under that same frame once. Jory. Only the wheel, and the long groan of the shaft, and the sound of Ivorton's whole valley riding on a stone that had begun to whisper. Marin stood in the doorway with her shoes on. 11 weeks before this night, Jory Trelawney had come up Pannel Creek with a canvas roll of tools and a girl who would not take her shoes off, and he had asked Enid Bevan for one hot meal. Now, before we go back to that July afternoon, if stories like this one are worth your evening, the subscribe button costs you nothing. And it tells me somebody out there still wants to hear about the work our grandparents did with their hands. That's all I'll ask. Let's get on with it. The last week of July 1930, the rain had been gone from Arvel County for 51 days. Jory Trelawney came up the creek road on foot at 4 in the afternoon with his daughter beside him and everything he owned in 2 bundles. The larger bundle was tools. He carried it across his shoulders with a leather strap that had been stitched by somebody who knew how to stitch leather, and he shifted it the way a man does when he has carried the same weight for a long time and has stopped expecting relief from it. He was 41. The road had put 10 years on him that his birthday had not. Marin was 11. She walked a half step behind and a half step to the left, which is where a child walks when she has learned to watch a man's hands. They had been turned off 3 places in 9 days. At the first in Waco, the miller had already sold his stones for the iron in the bands. At the second, the man had work but no room for a girl, and had said so with his thumbs in his belt. At the third, down on the Guyandot, a woman had given them supper on the porch step, and then stood in the doorway while they ate it. And Jory had understood that they would not be asked in, and had thanked her, and had gone. That night Marin had slept in her shoes. She had not taken them off since. The Bevan mill stood where Pannel Creek came off Sourwood Hollow and made its one hard turn before the flat. Jory saw the wheel first, 14 feet of overshot wheel, oak gone silver gray, the buckets rotted out of the lower third. The flume above it had dropped off its trestle at the far end and lay in the weeds like something shot. But the building was square. The sills were sound. Nobody had pulled the roof for the tin. He stopped in the road and looked at it for a long moment, and Marin stopped with him. "It's dead," she said. "It's asleep," Jory said. "There's a difference, and the difference is money." Enid Bevan was down at the stock trough with a bucket when she saw them, and she set the bucket down and did not straighten up right away, because a woman alone on a mountain road learns to take an extra second before she decides anything. She was 47. Her sleeves were pushed past the elbow. There was a smear of pale dust along the outside of her forearm, which was flour, because she had spent the morning grinding a peck of corn for herself in a hand mill bolted to her kitchen table, the way she had ground every peck for 6 years. The man in the road did not come closer. He set his tool roll down in the dirt first, which she noticed. "Ma'am," he said, "your wheel's got about $100 of rot in it, and about $4 of it matters." Enid did not answer that. "I'm not selling," she said. "I'm not buying." He waited. She waited longer. Down the hollow, a dog was barking at something that wasn't there. "My girl hasn't eaten since yesterday morning," Jory said. "Feed my boy." And he stopped, and corrected himself, because he was tired enough to have used the old sentence. The one he'd worn smooth on 300 porches, and it had a boy in it, and he had not had a boy in 2 years. Feed my girl, one hot meal and a dry place out of the weather, and I'll wake your dead mill. Enid Bevan looked at him for a while. Then she looked at the girl, who was standing very straight in the road in shoes that had been laced tight in July heat, and she understood that particular fact all the way through, the way you understand a thing you have no words for. The meal's not a trade, Enid said. The meal's just supper. Come on. She fed them at the table her hand mill was bolted to. Beans with a piece of side meat in them, and cornbread, and buttermilk from the spring house, and half a jar of pickled beets she had been saving without knowing what for. Marin ate carefully, in small bites, and stopped twice, which is a thing hungry children do when they have learned that eating fast can be a mistake. Jory said he wasn't hungry until Enid put the plate in front of him, and then he was. They traded the facts that had to be traded. Loveday Trelawney had died in the spring of 1928, in Braxton County, of something that started as a cough. Jory had gone back on the road 4 months later because a stone dresser who stops traveling stops eating. Owain Bevan had died in February of 1924 on the Ivorton Road, when the mule team slipped on ice hauling a new bedstone up the grade, and the sled came back down on him. He was bringing it here, Enid said. That stone still laying in the ditch at the second switchback. County went around it. And the mill's not turned since. October of 24. I ground out what corn was in the hopper and I shut the gate. She did not say the rest, and Jory did not ask it. 6 years is a long time to keep a building square for no reason. After supper, Enid went up to the loft and came down with a bed tick, and behind it, something she carried more carefully. It was a child's chair, cut down out of a kitchen chair, the legs shortened and the seat recaned. The caning was half finished. Somebody had stopped in the middle of a row and never come back to it. She set it by the stove without explanation. Marin slept that night on the tick by the fire with her shoes on. But she slept. Jory was up before the light, and he did not pick up a tool. This is the part people get wrong about the trade. A stone dresser who arrives and starts swinging is a man who intends to be paid and gone. The ones worth the money spend the first day doing nothing that makes a sound. He walked the race from the pond down. He put his hand flat on the breast of the dam and held it there. He climbed the trestle and sighted along the flume and found the sag. He counted the rotted buckets on the wheel, and then counted the sound ones, which is a different number and a more useful one. Inside, he took the crane and lifted the runner stone off the bedstone and turned it over on its back. And then he stood over the 2 exposed faces for a long time, with his hands behind him, not touching them, the way another man might stand over a horse he was thinking about buying. Enid came in and leaned on the door frame and watched him not touch anything. "Well," she said. Jory crouched by the bedstone. "You know what these are?" "French boer. Owain's father brought them up in 71. They're better than this county deserves." He ran one finger just above the surface, tracing without landing. "See these deep channels? Those are furrows. They're not there to grind. They're there to carry the corn out from the eye toward the rim and carry the air through with it, because air is what keeps the meal cool. The flat between them is the land. The land is what actually grinds. Owen called them the harps. Same thing. Your furrows run in groups, and the groups look like harp strings, and that's the name in every mill in this country." He tilted his head. "Now here's your trouble. A furrow's got a steep side and a slack side. The steep side is the cutting edge. When the top stone turns, its steep edges cross the bedstone's steep edges, and the corn gets scissored between them, thousands of times a second. That's the whole trade. 2 pair of scissors passing. He finally touched the stone, laying his palm flat on the land between 2 furrows. These edges are gone, rounded off. 6 years of sitting won't do that. This was worn out before your husband died. So he was grinding on tired stones, and he'd have known it, and he was hauling a new bedstone up that grade in February, because he couldn't get a dresser to come this far up for what he could pay." Enid did not move from the door frame. "He never told me the stones were bad." "No," Jory said. "He wouldn't have." He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, though there was nothing on them. "A dull stone doesn't cut the corn. It crushes it and rubs it. Rubbing makes heat. Cornmeal is mostly oil once you break the germ open, and hot oil in a sack in a warm kitchen goes rank inside of a month. Your husband was grinding meal that soured on people. That's how a mill loses a valley. Not all at once. One family at a time, and none of them tell you why. Bostic's mill down in Avorton doesn't sour. Bostic's mill takes the germ out and throws it to hogs. Keeps forever. Tastes like paper and feeds you about as well. He shrugged. And it takes cash. That last part landed. Enid's jaw moved once. Nobody in Arvel County had cash in the autumn of 1930. Bostic milling charged 40 cents a hundredweight, payable in coin, and the men on Pannel Creek were hauling corn 11 miles down a mountain to pay coin they did not have, because the alternative was a wheel that hadn't turned in 6 years. A country mill did not take coin. A country mill took toll, 1 part in 8, straight out of the hopper, and the miller ate what he kept. How long, Enid said, to dress both stones proper? A week apiece if I'm honest, and I've never met a man in a hurry who was. And the wheel, and the flume, and the dam. The dam's fine. The dam's the only thing on this place nobody's touched, which is why it's the only thing that works. He looked at her. Give me till the corn comes in. If your stones aren't cutting by then, I'll walk out of here and you'll have lost a bed tick and some beans. Enid Bevan crossed her arms. Show me your hands, she said. He held them out, palms up, without asking why, and that was the answer before the hands were. They were scarred the way all their kind were scarred. 100 small white nicks across the heels and the first joints of the fingers. And under the skin, fine and gray and permanent, that speck steel. Slivers thrown off the mill bill every time it struck the stone, driven under the skin and left there, year on year, until a man's hands were seeded with the metal of his own trade. Enid took his right hand and turned it toward the window light, and she did not do it gently. My father-in-law told Owain, she said, before you let a dresser touch a stone, you make him show you his metal. If it isn't in his hands, it was never in his work. Yes, ma'am. She let go. Tool shed's behind the spring house, Enid said. You'll want the crane chain regreased before you lift anything else. And Mr. Trelawney, the girl's shoes come off in my house. Tell her, or I will. By the 4th day, the mill had a sound in it again, and it was not a good sound. It was the sound of a mill bill striking bore. A hard, dry tick, one after another, 500 times an hour, 10,000 times a day. Jory worked the runner face on trestles, the stone up on its back, a leather pad under his forearm. He would set the bill in its wooden thrift, strike a line of fine cuts across the land, turn the thrift a quarter, strike again. Marin's job was the staff. He showed her once, a straight-edged wooden staff, its face painted with red ochre, laid across the stone and drawn over it. Wherever the stone stood proud, it took the paint. Wherever it sat low, it took nothing. Red means high, Jory said. High means it grinds and the rest of the stone doesn't. Find me the red. Marin found the red. She called it out in a flat voice, a spot at a time, the way a person calls out numbers when she wants very badly to be useful and does not know yet whether she is allowed to be. On the 9th morning, she came down to breakfast in her stocking feet. Enid set the plate down and said nothing at all about it. There was one thing Jory did not tell her about that week, and he was aware of not telling her. The runner stone did not sit on the spindle. It hung from it on an iron crosspiece let into the back of the stone, the bale, and the whole 4,000 pounds balanced on that one casting, adjusted by 2 brass screws no bigger than a thumb. Owen Bevan's bale had a hairline in the west arm. Jory found it on the 5th day, cleaned it with kerosene and a rag, and looked at it for a long while. A forge in Ivorton could have laid in a new one for $6. There were no $6, so he backed the west screw off a half turn to take the load off the crack, and he made a mark on the husk frame with a pencil, so he would know if the stone ever settled past it, and he went back to work. It would hold at a steady speed. It was the running up and the shutting down that hurt a cracked bale, the moment the water hit the wheel, and the moment it left. He told himself he would say something once the stones were cutting. Farrell Kesner came up the creek road on the 11th day with an empty truck, because he had already been down the mountain that morning with somebody else's corn. He was 38, and he owned the only truck on Pannel Creek, and since 1925 he had made his living hauling the Hollows corn 11 miles down to Bostic Milling and 11 miles back. $2 the load. He was not a bad man. He had 5 children and a note on the truck, and every sack that went into the Bevan mill was a sack that did not go into the back of it. He stood in the mill door with his hat in his hand and looked at the runner stone up on its trestles. "Enid Farrell, they're saying you've took on a drifter." "They're saying right." Kesner turned the hat over. 6 years that wheel's been quiet. Now a man walks up the creek with a sack of chisels, and all of a sudden, he stopped and started again, more carefully, because he had known this woman since they were children, and he was not enjoying himself. "Enid, if the hollow puts its corn in here and this thing don't run, that's their whole winter. Theirs." Jory did not look up from the stone. He set the bill, struck, turned the thrift, struck. "That's true," he said. Kesner had been braced for an argument and did not know what to do with agreement. "Then why in God's name would she let you try it?" Jory laid the bill down and straightened. There was gray dust in both his eyebrows. "Because it's true in the other direction too," he said. 40 cents a hundred, cash, in the fall of 1930. "How many of them paid you in corn this year instead of money, Mr. Kesner?" The hat stopped turning. "That's not your business." "No," Jory agreed, "but you know the number." Kesner put his hat back on. At the door he stopped and looked once more at the stone on the trestles, at the fresh cuts across the lands, thousands of them, laid in rows so straight they might have been ruled. He had seen a stone dressed before. He had been a boy, and Enid Bevan's father had been alive, and it had looked exactly like that. "It don't matter how pretty you make it," he said. "Creek's been dropping since June. You can dress them stones till they shine. You still got to have water to turn them." He was right, and everybody in the room knew he was right, and nobody said so. That night Enid stood on the dam breast after supper and looked at the pond, and she could see a foot of pale dry stone above the waterline that had not been showing in July. The runner went back down onto the spindle on the last day of August. Enid had expected some ceremony about it. There wasn't any. Jory greased the crane chain, walked the stone over, and let it settle. And then he lay a long time on the floor with a lamp, sighting the gap between the two faces from the side, and adjusted the tentering screw a quarter turn at a time, until he was satisfied with a distance he never actually named out loud. "How close?" Enid said. "Close enough that you couldn't slide a hair in, not so close they touch." He got up off the floor slower than he had a year ago. A stone that touches another stone makes sand. Nobody wants sand. That evening Enid brought the cut-down chair out from behind the stove and a hank of cane, and she finished the row somebody had stopped in the middle of 6 years earlier. She did it at the kitchen table without saying anything about it, and Marin sat across from her and watched her hands. And after a while, Enid turned the chair around so the girl could see the underside where the weave was ugly and honest. "That's mine," Enid said. "You can tell right where he quit and I started." Marin ran a thumb along the seam. "Yours is tighter," she said. "Mine's angry," said Enid. "That's different from tight." They ground the first corn in the second week of September, and it was good, and it was not enough. The meal came off the stone cool. Jory put his hand in the trough under the spout and held it there, and let Enid put her hand in beside his, and it was barely warmer than the room, and that, he told her, was the entire argument. This is the part of the trade that nobody outside a mill ever hears. A kernel of corn is mostly starch, but the small end of it, the germ, is nearly all oil. Grind the whole kernel between good cool stones and that oil stays in the meal, and that is why water-ground cornbread tastes like something and store meal tastes like paper. But oil is a clock. Heat it, or leave it sitting warm, and it starts turning, and meal that has turned is not a matter of opinion. You smell it the second you open the bin, and there is nothing on earth to be done with it. The big roller mills solved that by taking the germ out and selling it to the hogmen. Their meal keeps for years. It also does not feed a family through a winter the way whole meal does, and every woman in Arvel County knew it, and every one of them bought it anyway, because Bostic's meal was there, and cash was the only door. Cool stones, good furrows carrying air, meal spread thin to breathe before it ever went in a sack. That was the whole of it. That was what Jory Trelawney had walked 11 miles up a creek to sell. The trouble was the creek. By the third week of September, Pannel Creek was running so thin that the flume delivered a stream you could have put your 2 hands around. The wheel would turn on it. It would not turn well. Grind a mill too slow and the stones do not so much cut as loiter, and the meal comes out ragged. Jory worked it out on the dam breast one evening with a stick in the mud. They would not grind on the creek. They would grind on the pond. Close the head gate at dark. Let the whole night's flow, thin as it was, back up behind the dam. In the morning, open her wide and grind hard while it lasted. And when the pond was down, shut the gate and stop and wait again. Nobody in the hollow had run a mill that way in living memory, because nobody in living memory had needed to. 3 hours of full water a day. Sometimes less. How much corn is that, Enid said. About 9 sacks a day, if nothing breaks. She did the arithmetic out loud, and it came to more days than there were before frost, and neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that they would have to start before the hollow had decided to trust them. Reese Goff decided for the hollow. He was 81, and he had been a boy of 11 the summer Tudor Bevan built the dam, and he came up the creek road on a Sunday in a coat too heavy for the weather because he had put on his good one. He stood in the mill and listened for about 4 minutes with his hat off and his head tipped, and then he said something in Welsh that nobody there understood, and then he said it again in English. "That's the note," he said. "That is the note. I have not heard that note since Coolidge." He brought 2 sacks the next morning. By Thursday, there were 9 sacks along the wall. By the 1st of October, there were more than they could grind in the water they had, and every one of them had a name chalked on the burlap, and Enid was keeping the order of them in her head because she would not put it on paper where somebody could see who had come last. Miss Verlestott came up on the 4th of October in a county car she drove badly. She was 33, home demonstration agent for Arvel County, and she had a clipboard and a way of asking questions that let you know she had been lied to by men before and had stopped being surprised by it. "You're telling 26 families to put their winter meal in this building." "I'm not telling them anything," Enid said. "They're bringing it. That's worse." Miss Stott looked at the stones, and then at Jory, and then, deliberately, at his hands. "I've had 4 households in this county lose their bins since I took this post. Meal goes over, and they don't tell me until February. And then there's a family eating what's left of nothing. So I'm going to do something and you're not going to like it." She took 3 pint jars out of her bag. One she filled with meal from the Bevan's spout. One she filled from a sack of Bostick's that she had bought that morning in Ivorton with her own 40 cents. The third she filled from a bin Enid had kept in the loft since 1924. The last meal Owain Bevan ever ground, on stones nobody had dressed in a decade. She sealed all 3, wrote the date on all 3, and put them on the sill in the mill office where the light hit them. "January," she said. "I'll open them in front of whoever wants to watch, and if yours is gone, I will stand in the Ivorton post office and say so." "That's fair," said Jory. "It isn't fair at all," Miss Stott said. "It's just honest. Fair would be if any of these people had a choice." The creek dropped below the lip of the flume on the 9th of October. After that, the pond took 11 hours to fill what it had filled in 3 in August. They ground in the mornings and shut down at noon, and Enid stopped sleeping properly, and Jory started taking the lamp down under the husk frame at night to look at a pencil mark on a piece of oak. By the 2nd week, the mark had moved. It was that 2nd week of October, on a night when they had run late trying to finish out the Goff sacks, that the runner stone began to whisper. Jory heard it in the pitch before it was anything anyone else could hear. He was under the husk frame with the lantern almost before Enid understood he had moved. And then his voice came up through the floorboards, flat and very clear, the way a man's voice goes when he has decided not to be afraid in front of a child. "Enid, don't drop the gate. It's going hot." "I know it. Listen to me." A pause, the sound of a shoulder braced against something. "The bail's gone in the west arm. It's holding because it's turning. You drop that gate and stop 4,000 pounds all at once. That stone comes off the spindle." And Jory Trelawney was underneath it. "Feather it," he said. "Bring the gate down slow, slower than you think. Take 5 minutes if it takes 5 minutes." The sluice lever on the Bevan Dam was a length of white oak that a man of ordinary strength moved with both hands and a shoulder. Enid Bevan was not a man of ordinary strength. She got both hands on it and put her weight against the water, and brought it down an inch at a time, holding at each inch, and the wheel came off its speed slow and grudging. And the whisper under the floor stretched out and lowered and did not become the other sound, the sound she had spent 6 years knowing what it would be. She was 3 inches from the bottom when the mill door opened. Farrell Kesner had been parked at the road for an hour and 20 minutes. He had driven up to say something and had not been able to think of it, and had sat there instead with his hands on the wheel, listening to a mill run in the dark. He crossed the floor and put both hands on the lever above hers, and neither of them said one word, and together they brought it the rest of the way down. The wheel stopped. The stone stopped whole. Jory came out from under the frame with grease to the elbow, and the three of them stood there in the dark building, breathing. "Well," Kesner said finally. "That was stupid." "It was," said Jory. "How much is a new one of them?" $6 at a forge. Farrell Kesner looked at the floor for a moment. Then he took out his billfold, and there were not $6 in it, and everybody could see that there were not, and he put 4 on the meal table anyway. "Rest of it comes out of the hauling," he said. "I'm going down for it Thursday." He went to the door and stopped there with his hat in his hand, the same as the first time. "And that bedstone in the ditch at the second switchback," he said. "The one Owain was bringing up. It's been laying there 6 years, and the county's been driving around it like it was a rock. It is a rock, Farrell. It's $400 of French bourre is what it is." Kesner put his hat on. "I got a truck and a winch and no corn to haul on Thursday, seeing as everybody's bringing it here. Might as well go get the man's stone." It took 11 men and most of a Saturday. They came without being asked because word had gone around the way it does. They brought chain and cant hooks and one badly overloaded truck, and they got Enid Bevan's bedstone up out of the ditch at the second switchback where it had lain since February of 1924, and they brought it the last 2 miles to the mill his father built, and they set it down on the flat. Nobody made a speech. Somebody's wife had brought a large bucket of coffee. Enid Bevan stood off to the side and watched 11 men she had known all her life put her husband's stone on the ground in her yard. 6 years and 8 months after he had died trying to do it himself, and she did not cry until well after everyone had gone. Miss Verlestat opened the jars on the 11th of January in the Ivorton post office with about 40 people watching. It was also, as one woman observed out loud, still Bostic's. The 1924 jar, the last meal Owain ever ground, was rank. You could smell it from the second row. It had been sealed 6 years. But Miss Stott made the point that mattered. It had gone over inside the first winter. And everyone who bought meal out of the Bevan mill in the autumn of 1924 had known it, and not one of them had told him why they stopped coming. Then she opened the third jar and passed it along the row. It smelled like corn. 24 of the 26 households on Pannel Creek opened their bins sweet this month, Miss Stott said. The 2 that didn't stored theirs over a chimney breast, and I've told them so, and they've told me where to put it. She closed her clipboard. "That's the report. I'll be putting it in writing." Rhys Goff said the thing in Welsh again, and this time he translated it, and it turned out to mean nothing more mysterious than the wheel is turning. A man from over the ridge asked, in the noise afterward, who it was that had dressed the stones. The drifter he'd heard, some fellow that came up the creek in the summer. "Our dresser," said Farrell Kesner. Jory Trelawney never made a speech about it either. The nearest he came was at the mill door in February, when a newspaper man from Charleston drove up on the strength of Miss Stott's report and asked him how he had brought a dead mill back. "I didn't wake anything," Jory said. "Owain Bevan built a mill that was still square 6 years after he quit needing it, and he wore his stones out feeding people who didn't tell him what was wrong. All I did was sharpen what the man left. Then what would you call yourself?" "Late," Jory said, and went back inside. He stayed. There was no wedding that spring, and there was not one the spring after either. And the hollow made its own arrangement with the arithmetic and got on with things, because a mountain will tolerate almost anything that works. What there was this. In March, Enid Bevan took Marin's hands and turned them palms up toward the window light. The same window, the same light, the same grip her father-in-law had taught to her husband, and her husband had taught to her. Marin was 12 by then. She had been swinging a bill on the bedstone since Christmas, an hour a day, no more, because that is how long a child's wrist is worth trusting. There, at the base of the right thumb, under the skin, one gray speck. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Enid said, "there you are. Now, I've spent a fair amount of my life around old buildings that people gave up on, and I'll tell you the thing that surprises me every time. it is almost never the roof. The roof is usually fine. What kills a place is some small hard part in the middle of it that wore out quietly. And nobody had the money or the nerve to say so out loud. And so everybody just stopped coming and nobody ever said why. I think about the men on Pannel Creek who tasted rank meal in 1924 and were too kind to mention it. And I don't judge a one of them. Kindness that won't say a true thing is still kindness. It's just expensive. And I think it's worth remembering that the man who fixed it didn't bring anything but his hands and a girl who wouldn't take her shoes off. Everything else he needed was already standing there in the weeds, square and waiting, because somebody's grandfather built it right. That's usually how it goes. The inheritance is nearly always still there. It's the sharpening we let go of. This story is true-to-life fiction. Arvel County, Ivorton, Pannel Creek, and every person in this account are creative inventions, and any resemblance to real people or places is entirely coincidental.